What began as a routine missing person case would soon unravel into one of the most disturbing crimes Grand Rapids had witnessed in years. In early December 2019, a chilling confession sent shockwaves across Michigan. A man walked into a Home Depot, calmly asked an employee to call the police, and claimed he had murdered two of his closest friends. That man was George Yzaguirre. Police rushed to respond. Officers soon arrived in an RV park on a freezing winter night where snow covered the ground and squad cars painted the darkness in red and blue lights. Inside one of the RVs, they found the body of a man who had been brutally stabbed. There were no signs of escape, no chance at survival. The violence was intense, personal, and horrifying. Investigators quickly learned that this discovery wasn't random. George himself had told police exactly where to look. As news spread, disbelief turned into fear, and then into heartbreak. A marriage built on false promises. Among those most devastated by the news was Jennifer Mayer, George's wife. To the outside world, their relationship once looked like a fresh start, two people building a life together after pain and struggle. But behind closed doors, a darker reality was growing. Jennifer had met George shortly after escaping a violent relationship. He appeared protective, charming, and attentive, everything she felt she had been missing. He listened when others had ignored her. He made her laugh when she felt broken. To her, he seemed like safety after chaos. For a while, that illusion felt real. They moved in together quickly. George showered her with attention. He made her feel valued. In her words, she believed she had finally found someone who would support her, protect her, and build a future with her. Within a short time, she believed she had found the jackpot. But people who study abusive behavior know how these stories often begin, with affection, attention, and intense emotional bonding. And slowly, the mask slips. The rise of control and alcohol. As months passed, Jennifer noticed changes. When George drank, his personality shifted sharply. The charming man who once made her feel safe became volatile and unpredictable. Yelling turned into threats, sarcasm turned into cruelty. Emotional abuse slowly became a routine. Jennifer had endured abuse before, so at first she minimized it. Compared to her past, she told herself it's not as bad, but that logic kept her trapped. The drinking worsened. George lost jobs. He made reckless decisions. At one point, while working around alcohol daily, he began drinking on the job again and was fired after crashing equipment in a workplace accident. Yet, despite everything, Jennifer still hoped he would change. When he sobered up for a period, she believed the worst was behind them. That hope pushed them toward marriage. She imagined a clean beginning, a healed future, the American dream she had always wanted. But the dream shattered faster than she could have imagined. On their wedding day, George relapsed. Soon after, the abuse escalated from verbal threats to physical violence. Jennifer would later describe waking up to his hands around her throat. The fear was no longer emotional. It was survival. A friend named David. Throughout much of George's life, there had been one consistent figure, David Isner, his childhood friend. They grew up together, rode bikes together, and considered each other brothers. David's family treated George like one of their own. More importantly, David tried to keep George grounded. When George struggled with alcohol, David encouraged him to seek help. When George lost direction, David tried to guide him back. For years, David had been a stabilizing force in George's chaotic world. Eventually, after Jennifer and George married, David moved in with them to help with rent and support George during another attempt at sobriety. For Jennifer, David's presence felt like protection. When arguments escalated, David would step in. He wasn't just a roommate, he was a shield. But even shields can shatter. By late November 2019, Jennifer finally found the strength to leave. After a terrifying incident involving threats of murder and suicide, she fled to her sister's home. For the first time, George was alone, with only David left under the same roof. And that's when everything changed.
In the early hours of November 28, 2019, while most of Grand Rapids slept under cold winter skies, David Isner sat inside the duplex he shared with his lifelong friend George Yzaguirre. Outside, the streets were quiet. Inside, the danger was already awake. Just before 4 a.m., David video called his girlfriend, Julia Venetin. On her screen, everything seemed normal. David was relaxed, casually eating a bowl of oatmeal. They laughed about small things. They talked about life, about work, about nothing in particular. It was ordinary. peaceful, safe. Nothing in that moment hinted that it would be the last time she would ever see him alive. When the call ended, Julia went back to sleep thinking nothing of it. To her, it was just another late-night check-in with the man she loved. But that morning, something felt wrong. The messages that never came. When Julia woke up a few hours later, she sent David a message. No reply. At first, she brushed it off. Maybe he was asleep. Maybe he had stepped out. But as the hours passed, her worry grew heavier. David always replied quickly. Always. By afternoon, the silence felt unbearable. Julia began calling over and over again. Each unanswered call tightened the knot in her stomach. By evening, her fear was no longer quiet. It was screaming. She contacted David's family. Soon, everyone was worried. And yet, strangely, one person showed no concern at all. George. A lie that raised red flags. Jennifer, now living with her sister for safety, joined the growing search effort. Though she had left George, David still mattered deeply to her. He had protected her so many times. She wanted answers. She tried calling George repeatedly. When he finally answered, something about his voice felt wrong. He didn't sound worried. He didn't sound confused. He sounded distant, almost detached. When asked about David, George casually replied that he was on a bender and had gone out of town. Jennifer didn't believe him for a second. That wasn't David. Julia didn't believe it either. While friends searched the neighborhood, they stumbled upon something even more concerning. David's car was parked in a church lot next door to the duplex. Why would his car be there if he had supposedly left town? Fear quickly turned into suspicion, and one name kept rising to the surface. George. The police can't enter. As worry spread through the neighborhood, Julia requested a welfare check at the duplex. Police arrived, knocked on the doors, looked through the windows, but without a tenant present to grant entry, their hands were tied. They left. David was still missing. By the next day, David's father officially filed a missing persons report. News stations began broadcasting his photo. Friends shared posts online. A community began searching desperately for a man who, unknown to them, was already gone. Still, half the truth remained buried in silence. Returning to a house of horror. On December 3rd, Jennifer felt driven by something she couldn't explain. She wanted to return to the duplex, not for George, but for her dog. She didn't know where George or David were, but she hoped at least her pet was still inside. Because of her history with abuse, police agreed to escort her. Jennifer unlocked the door and stepped inside. Almost immediately, officers stopped her. What they saw changed everything. Blood. Not a small stain, not a drop, but signs of a violent struggle, especially inside David's bedroom. The space had become a crime scene. Jennifer was ordered outside immediately. Officers secured the home. In that moment, the missing persons case officially became a homicide investigation. And now, only one question mattered. Where was George? The confession. Before police could track him down, George made the next move himself. He walked into a Home Depot. Calm. Unemotional. He asked an employee to call 911 because he wanted to turn himself in. Moments later, police received the call. A man is confessing to killing his two best friends. Jennifer learned the news from television. She watched in disbelief as the name of the man she once loved appeared at the bottom of the screen as a murder suspect. David had not been found yet, but the truth was already bleeding into the open.
Once George Yzaguirre was in police custody, the truth came out in fragments, slow, chilling, and almost impossible to comprehend. At first, George admitted only to killing David Isner. According to his confession, in the early morning hours of November 28th, while David slept in his bedroom, George picked up a knife and attacked him without warning. There was no fight, no chance to run, no defense. The number of wounds shocked even veteran investigators. David had been stabbed more than 70 times. This wasn't an act of panic. It wasn't an accident. This was rage, raw, personal, and uncontrollable. Detectives struggled to understand how someone could slaughter the one person who had stood by him through addiction, failure, and violence. The man who once shared bikes, childhood memories, and brotherhood had become his victim. Even worse, George refused to give a clear reason. He was like my brother. When Jennifer was informed of David's murder, the weight of it nearly crushed her. She lost her breath, her body went numb. Her mind refused to accept what her ears heard. David had defended her, protected her, supported George, paid rent, helped him recover, and George murdered him in his sleep. Investigators believe jealousy played a role. George had lost everything: his wife, his sense of control, and his self-image. Meanwhile, David had love, stability, and a pregnant girlfriend waiting for him. To someone like George, that contrast may have felt unbearable. David had the life George wanted, and George chose to take it. A second confession no one expected. But the horror didn't end with David. During questioning, George stunned detectives again. He confessed to a second murder. Just 5 days after killing David, George went to visit another man named Ed Fuller, a former coworker who had once supplied him with pain pills after surgery. Ed lived alone in an RV in Kentwood. George claimed that he went there looking for money and drugs. What happened next followed the same terrifying pattern. Ed was stabbed to death inside his RV. No signs of a struggle, no warning, no escape. Investigators later believed George killed Ed to steal his credit cards, cash, and possibly to use his identity as part of an escape plan. But like David's murder, this crime was rushed, messy, and poorly hidden. George wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was spiraling. 2 bodies, 2 locations. After confessing, George finally revealed where both bodies were located. Ed Fuller's body was exactly where George said it would be, inside the RV in Kentwood. But David's body had been moved. He had transported it nearly 16 miles away, dumping it in a remote area near Lake Michigan Drive. The scene suggested a rushed attempt to hide what he had done, moving the body but leaving the actual crime scene soaked in blood. It was a half-hearted cover-up, undone by his own conscience, or his own arrogance. When police confirmed that David's body had been found, Julia's world collapsed. Loss and new life collide. Julia received the news like a physical blow. At first, she couldn't believe it. Denial wrapped around her like armor. Then came confirmation. David was truly gone. The grief was unbearable. And within that same week, Julia discovered something that made the pain both heavier and more complicated. She was pregnant with David's child. Joy and devastation collided inside her at the same time. She would carry a piece of David forward, but he would never meet his child, never hold them, never protect them, never return home. The guilty plea. 8 months later, George Yzaguirre stood in court facing the consequences of his actions. By then, his guilt was undeniable. The evidence was overwhelming, the confessions were recorded, the bodies were recovered. George pled guilty to both murders. There was no trial, no defense, no denial. Only finality. Julia attended the sentencing. Jennifer did not. She wasn't ready to face the man who had nearly destroyed her life. During her victim impact statement, Julia spoke directly to George. She demanded to know how he felt while committing the murders. She wanted him to understand the life he had destroyed, the child who would now be born without a father. George showed no emotion, no tears, no remorse, no apology, only silence. He was sentenced to 2 life terms in prison. But justice, as it turned out, still wasn't finished with George Yzaguirre. When George Yzaguirre was escorted out of the courtroom in chains, many believed the nightmare was finally over. 2 lives had been stolen, 2 families shattered, and a killer had been locked away forever. But for Jennifer Meyer, the trauma did not end with the sentence. In many ways, it was only beginning. Life behind bars. Inside Kent County Jail, George quickly gained a reputation, not for remorse, not for reflection, but for his cold, unsettling pride. Jennifer would later receive a letter from him, one she never expected. In it, George didn't apologize for murdering David. He didn't express grief for Ed. He didn't acknowledge the pain he caused. Instead, he bragged. He told her other inmates had given him a nickname, the Natural, a natural killer. There was no guilt in his words, only ego. To psychologists, this behavior was chilling but not surprising. George no longer viewed people as human beings with lives and futures. To him, people were still possessions, objects he could dominate, manipulate, or destroy. Even from behind bars, he wanted control. The divorce that took 8 months. After the sentencing, Jennifer immediately filed for divorce. She had already escaped the marriage physically. Now she needed to be free legally. But George refused to sign. For 8 long months, he delayed the process again and again. Each refusal wasn't about paperwork. It was about power. Even locked inside a cell for life, he still wanted to hold on to Jennifer, to control her existence, to delay her freedom, to remind her that he still mattered. In another letter, George wrote that she could never take away the memories they shared. The words weren't loving, they were possessive. It was as if he still believed she belonged to him, despite everything. Investigators later explained this type of behavior as post-incarceration control, when abusers continue manipulating from behind bars, using emotional hooks, guilt, fear, and delays. Jennifer was not just divorcing a man. She was fighting a shadow. The meaning behind the teardrops. George had once gotten 2 teardrop tattoos under his eye. Before the murders, he claimed they symbolized loss, not killing. But after his conviction, that meaning felt disturbingly different. To Julia, to Jennifer, to the families of the victims, those tattoos no longer looked symbolic. They looked like warnings that had gone ignored. No remorse in the courtroom. Those who attended the sentencing described George as unemotional and detached. When Julia spoke about raising David's child without him, George stared forward, unmoved. When David's mother cried for her son, the man she once considered another child, didn't flinch. There was no apology, no visible regret, only a blank stare. It hurt the families deeply, not just because of what he'd done, but because of what he refused to feel. The final call. In May 2021, nearly 2 years into his life sentence, Jennifer received an unexpected phone call from a prison official. George had been found dead in his cell, an apparent suicide. There were no public details released beyond that. The news hit differently for everyone. For some, it felt like closure. For others, like another unanswered question. Jennifer felt conflicted. For years, she had tried to stop George from harming himself. She had stood in doorways to stop him from drinking. She had begged him to change. She had tried to save his life again and again. And yet, after murdering 2 innocent men, he still ended his own life anyway. To her, it felt like the final cowardly act. Survivor's guilt and release. Jennifer also struggled with guilt. She believed the timing of George's suicide was connected to one thing: the finalization of the divorce. Once the paperwork went through, once the last legal tie was cut, he had nothing left to control. No wife, no identity, no future. Only his crimes. And that reality may have been too heavy for even him to carry. Yet for all the pain, one truth remained: George would never hurt anyone again.
After George Yzaguirre's death in prison, the world did not suddenly feel peaceful for those he left behind. Justice may have arrived in the legal sense, but emotionally, the damage was permanent. No sentence and no suicide could return 2 stolen lives. For Jennifer Meyer, healing did not come quickly. The years she spent with George left deep scars, some visible, most hidden. She had survived abuse, control, fear, and betrayal at the highest level. Now she faced an unfamiliar challenge: learning how to live without chaos. For a long time, she blamed herself. She wondered how she had missed the signs, how love had blinded her, how the man she trusted most had turned into a murderer. The guilt was heavy, but slowly, through therapy, education, and self-reflection, Jennifer began to understand something important. She had been a victim too. Abusers don't arrive as monsters. They arrive as saviors. A new purpose. Today, Jennifer's life looks nothing like her past. She returned to school. She found her voice again through writing and music. Poetry became her therapy. Singing became her release. Most importantly, she learned to recognize red flags: narcissism, manipulation, love bombing, and control. What once trapped her now educated her. She often says that survival changed her, but it didn't destroy her. It rebuilt her. A mother without a partner. For Julia Van Netten, grief arrived alongside motherhood. She carried David's child while mourning his death, a cruel emotional contradiction. The man she loved would never hold their baby. Their future had been erased overnight. Raising a child without David was the hardest thing she had ever done. But every laugh, every milestone, every smile, she sees David again. In their child's face, in the way they move, in the little gestures only a parent would recognize. David didn't get to grow old, but part of him still walks this world. An unbreakable bond. In the aftermath of the murders, something unexpected happened. Jennifer and Julia became friends, not out of convenience, not out of obligation, but out of shared trauma and survival. They had both loved men connected to the same monster. They had both lived through terror, and they both understood each other in ways no one else could. They leaned on one another through court dates, nightmares, grief, and healing. Over time, friendship grew into sisterhood. 2 women connected by pain, now connected by strength. David's legacy. David Isner is remembered not as a victim, but as a protector, a man who stood up for others, a loyal friend, a loving partner, and a future father whose life was taken too soon. Those who knew him speak of his humor, his kindness, and how easily he made people feel safe. Even in death, his life still creates love, and that is something no killer can erase. The truth that remains. George Yzaguirre left behind devastation, but he did not take everything. He did not take Jennifer's future, he did not take Julia's strength, he did not take David's legacy, and he did not take the truth. The truth is this: monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like lovers, friends, husbands. That is why these stories matter, because awareness saves lives. Moving forward.